the rim. Garnett on the slam. Oh, here's a Curry way downtown. Oh, what a shot from Curry.
Okay, let's try this one more time. I posted a version of this video 24 hours before Luka Doncic got traded. Don't ask, I don't know. Either way, it then got copyrighted once, which made one part of the video pretty much unwatchable, and then it got copyrighted again, which then blocked the video, and I just realized this about a day or two ago. It's been a crazy couple weeks. Either way, it's fine. Hopefully that's taken care of. If it gets blocked again, it'll be fixed. But also, it gave me the chance to fix a couple of things in the video and add the part at the end where we can talk about a little bit of the context surrounding the last 2 weeks. It was cool to see the reaction or what we thought about the Mavericks right before he was traded, but I did want this part in the video. So without further ado, for the final time, here's the Dallas Mavericks documentary. At a glance, roughly the first 17 years of Dallas Mavericks' existence seems pretty obscure, yet under the surface, it starts getting deep rather quickly, and you'll come away with the opinion that they probably should have just ended up like the Hornets. Only 6 total playoff appearances from 1981 to 2000, with 1 conference finals trip which actually went the distance against the Showtime Lakers. They were relatively on track for an expansion team, then it nosedived through what I assume was a heartbreaking era for the new fan base. In one of the worst follow-ups in NBA history, various circumstances led to the conference finals core immediately disintegrating, resulting in a 38-win 1989 season which barely scratched the surface of how far a promising franchise would soon fall. From 91 to 2000, they'd missed 10 straight postseasons through a combination of misfortune and specific decisions, which is why you've probably never even heard of the potential Big Three they were fielding around the time. Multiple poor seasons after the initial blow-up led to them drafting Jim Jackson, Jamal Mashburn, and Jason Kidd by 1994, one by one. Not only did Kidd win just one of 3 Colt Rookie of the Years ever, which is a conversation for another day, the new triple-double machine helped improve their record by 23 wins, a league-best improvement. He became part of a promising future with the 3 J's, encompassing him, Jamal Mashburn, and Jim Jackson. 2 top-scoring wings, paired with a versatile young Peachy. What could go wrong? The very next season, Mashburn would see action in only 18 games, suffering microfracture knee surgery, which you're likely familiar with for being a career death sentence. Except in this case, he went on to revive it in Miami, crediting Pat Riley for the resurgence. In my opinion, the premature trade kinda spoke to the level of instability which led to Dallas never placing higher than 10th seed throughout this time. Because the thing I didn't mention is, they'd already traded Jason Kidd. In December 1996, after he'd made an All-Star appearance in year 2, Kidd was sent to Phoenix in a deal bringing back Sam Cassell and Michael Finley. Mashburn and Jackson were dealt shortly after. The rumors back then alleged how singer Tony Braxton was the center of issues between Kidd and Jackson, though this has been denied as recently as 2024. Outside of the clashing between potential co-stars, Kidd was also said to have constant problems with the coaching staff, as he didn't like the offense installed by new coach Jim Clemens. A couple years back, he called being exiled from Dallas so early in his career, quote, a Christmas gift. Whatever the specific circumstances were, Jackson and Mashburn to this day feel they weren't given enough time and could have risen to prominence out west. Quote, the reason to me why I didn't work with the Mavericks wasn't about Tony Braxton rumors. I was there for years. I had 3 owners and 4 coaches. We had no stability, Jackson said. People don't understand the dynamics around the team is why it didn't work. We didn't have stability in the front office, which then led to instability on the court. So Jason, Jamal, and I never played 82 games together. The 3 J's, gone far too soon, and the resulting rosters did absolutely nothing worth discussing. Enter Steve Nash. It's at this point I want to mention how confused I was growing up with the whereabouts of Nash and Kidd early on in their careers, as you'll see Kidd play for Dallas multiple times and Nash play for Phoenix multiple times. Meanwhile, they also played together. Hopefully, if you suffered the same thing, this video clears up the timeline. Nash had been drafted to Phoenix in '96, ironically becoming the backup to new star point guard Jason Kidd from Dallas. In 1998, Don Nelson's son, who became the assistant general manager of the Mavs, convinced his father to trade for Nash, who he thought was being slept on. He was right. The deal had been done on draft night, where also entered Dirk Nowitzki, a tall, lanky German kid who'd been drafted by the Bucks and dealt to Dallas. One of the craziest trades ever, by the way. The Mavericks used the draft rights of Robert Tractor Trailer for the fleece, as Milwaukee wanted physicality in their big. How does an unstable franchise who'd been making mistake after mistake randomly create such a hit? Well, when Ross Perot had purchased the Mavs, one of the goals was to get more basketball minds involved. Minority owner Frank Zaccanelli remembers how Kobe Bryant wasn't even on their draft board in 1996, saying, quote, "It gives you an idea of where the franchise was at the time." When Don Nelson took over general managing in 97, he reportedly walked into the locker room and asked who wanted to be traded, to which 75% of the team raised their hands. He was aggressive in his dealings. As you'll remember, this is a reason Jim Jackson felt the Jays weren't given proper time. Meanwhile, his son Donnie had already been in Europe watching over Dirk, whose game he instantly took a liking to. Once Don laid eyes on him, he told Zaccanelli, quote, "This kid has a chance to revolutionize the game of basketball." Man, some basketball minds were just born for it, and this will make even more sense later when you learn in detail what he did to him as coach of Golden State. From there, Nelson was so convinced, he took measures to try and keep Dirk from being so much as seen by other NBA teams, ultimately pulling together the deal with Milwaukee to acquire him, while simultaneously sending the draft rights of Pat Garrity away for Steve Nash, all in one heist. A franchise which might have been bad enough to fold after a decade now had an electric scorer in Michael Finley, with two young, promising prospects to grow alongside him. A leap of faith? Maybe, but could it really turn out any worse than things had been since they were nearly in the finals years ago? As you can tell by looking at him, Dirk took his lumps initially, though instantly improving in year 2 to become the second leading scorer on the team, while Dallas saw its first 40-win season since 1990. By 2001, the Mavericks had officially rebounded, with Nowitzki's first All-Star season and Nash's first true campaign as a starter. Averaging 15 and 7 with electric passing, they'd successfully replaced the three Jays with a trio who could coexist and hopefully win a title in the near future. Not before something else extremely significant happened. You probably don't know very many owners of professional sports teams on the level you know the players. You know their names, maybe what they bought the team for, and their involvement in driving the team into the ground through their various styles. Mark Cuban purchased the Mavs in 2000, not as an investment, nor as a flex, but as a fan. He truly wanted to see this so far perilous organization do well, have fun, and make money. Through his tenure, I'd say he accomplished most of that. I could probably do an entire video on his impact, but in this flick, just know you'll hear about the guy again and again throughout. Coincidentally, Dallas graced their first postseason in a decade under his ownership, where they kicked things off by sending Stockton and Malone packing. Kind of symbolic in a way, given it was at the hands of potentially the next great guard-big duo. Also symbolic was their second-round gentleman sweep at the hands of San Antonio, one of the West's next juggernauts who'd routinely stand roadblock to any aspiring contender. No worries, a 53-win season and entry to the semifinals was a great restart, and the young core had already proven to be more than just potential. Headed for 0-2, they were in a flat-out great position, upping it to 57 wins, with Dirk and Nash both entering very fringe MVP convos, albeit it was definitely an indicator for future endeavors. Unfortunately, they faced the same issues as any 2000s West team suffered, the West itself. The 57 wins, which would have easily made them the best team in the East, notched merely a 4th seed here, behind champions such as the Lakers and Spurs, and a routine championship hopeful in Sacramento. While they were able to sweep Minnesota, who were years away from their best roster, they'd come up short to the Kings, who were headed toward a less than stellar fate in the conference finals. Run it back. Headed to their 5th season, the new power simply needed to get over the hump, which, as we know, just doesn't always happen. Yet there was a strong feeling this one could be it. By now, they tagged on support pieces such as Raja Bell and Nick Van Exel, providing a fairly solid core around their progressing stars, Van Exel coming in 4th for 6th man of the year. They were able to start the season winning 14 straight, holding steady at 38 and 10 by All-Star break. The two were now solidified, leading Dallas to its first 60-win season in franchise history. There wasn't much left to do than finish the job, which is of course much easier said than done in the Wild West. As you've probably guessed, the 60 wins only tied them for first with the Spurs and held them one game above Sacramento. It also brought them face to face with the 50-win Trailblazers in round 1, who were only a few years removed from nearly having blocked Kobe and Shaq's first title. Be it so, this was the last postseason they'd attend until the end of the decade, falling in 7 to the tandem who appeared to have officially arrived. Dirk poured in 46, 42, and 35 points throughout, bringing them back against the Kings, who were probably feeling like they should have been defending a title rather than trying to reach the first. Sadly, as you'll see when we arrive at their deep dive one day, the early 2000s just weren't at all friendly to an otherwise amazing team. During Game 2, Chris Webber suffered a non-contact meniscus tear, essentially ending the Kings' real hopes for good before anyone knew it. Knowing his impact, this makes it even crazier the series still managed to go 7, with the Mavs sealing the deal behind a 30-point game from Dirk, while Nash nearly turned in a triple-double with 18 points and 13 assists. "We didn't have Chris. What do you expect?" was the quote from Bobby Jackson after elimination, which was likely a sentiment shared amongst many, seeing as how it was their best player and how easily they'd handled them a year earlier with him present. Of course, with a what if, you'll never be able to definitively say anything, which was what made the Western Conference Finals so gut-wrenching for Dallas fans. In the present, you'll see memes floating around about the Mavs' most recent misfortunes, claiming they're no stranger to it. They really aren't. The final test before the NBA Finals was, of course, the San Antonio Spurs, who'd arrived by way of knocking off the three-peat Lakers. Up to Game 3, the West Finals were tied, with both teams having come away with 13-point wins each. It was due to be a dogfight between the two best teams record-wise in the league. That's when it happened. A little over a year ago, Nowitzki claims that even if he hadn't suffered the devastating knee sprain in Game 3, they still probably wouldn't have beaten the Spurs. He's humble as usual, although it's completely reasonable to think this way. Still, it's been hard for me to ignore through the years how this series somehow went 6 afterwards, albeit it was after falling in the 3-1 ditch. In any case, a top 10 defense who'd ranked first in offense and had a top duo in the league wouldn't even get a proper chance to see where they truly were after all this time growing and kidding the roster. It only made it worse how hard it was to even get that far in the first place. How many more down years could you really expect out of Shaq and Kobe? Didn't matter. The only thing they could do was regroup and try again. Except, despite Dirk being just 25 years of age, time was becoming of the essence for Nash, who was approaching 30 and contract negotiations. I'll be the first to say I am as confused now on what happened here as I always was when I saw pictures of 2 of the greatest players of the 2000s sharing the floor, only to realize at some point it abruptly ended. And it wasn't like Nash hadn't already shown greatness. This is what I assumed to be the case in my childhood. He'd accumulated 2 All-Star appearances, had MVP mentions, made 2 All-NBA teams, and played 82 games of 2002 and 2003. Yet in 04, there was a slight reduction. He posted none of the accolades just mentioned, scored a little less, and Dallas fell back to 5th seed with only 52 wins. Chemistry was partly to blame, as they struggled out the gates with their new additions of Antoine Jamison, who won 6th Man of the Year, and Antoine Walker. Also of note, rookies Josh Howard and Marquise Daniels were able to make an impact, committed to memory for later. The offensive excellence was sustained, however their defense nosedived to 26th in the league. Where in previous years you'd seen some acceptable bigger bodies in the paint, Dirk was their center this time around, while Walker posted up at power forward. Even with how basketball is played today, that's literally unacceptable in almost any era as a defensive interior. Which, also make note of this for a few years down the line. Oh yeah, tack on Nash as the point guard and teams could now sleepwalk their way into buckets against Dallas. Adding insult, Weber returned, helping lift them to another gentleman sweep in round 1. Man, I would have loved to have seen the year-to-year discourse concerning their playoff meetings. This was quite possibly the worst year for Dallas to fall off as a whole, because for some reason, the result was bad enough to give an excuse to call Nash into question. And I still don't fully understand why. Today, Cuban claims they were concerned about injuries. He missed 4 total regular season games over a 3-year span leading up to summer 2004. He also claims his minutes had been reduced to around 29 a game over the concerns, where we can see he was playing nearly 34 still, okay. Alas, quote, he had been injured the year before and his minutes were declining, and our doctor was like, he may have some issues. And Don Nelson was like, he may have some issues. From Mark Cuban. But I will note here, Don Nelson was reportedly not at all happy about losing Steve. I'm still so confused on which injuries are being referred to here, but regardless, he was basically 30. The roster was getting kind of pricey between Walker, Finley, Jamison, and Nowitzki, while they apparently had reason to believe they were about to tie up even more in what was due to become an injury-prone, older point guard. In light of the assumptions, Cuban offered a 4-year deal worth about $9 million per, with a 5th year partially guaranteed. What? Then there was his former team in Phoenix, who did everything short of standing outside his mansion with a boombox. They flew 12 members out to offer him a $63 million 6-year deal. Nash loved Dirk, and he loved Dallas. He did not want to leave. He even called them back and asked Mark to reconsider, to which Cuban recalls he still has a pad from the phone call with the words, "Mike Baby Money," written on it, which was what he was hearing Nash wanted. He didn't so much as make a counteroffer. The disrespectful lowball stood. He would go on to write in a blog shortly after Nash left, quote, "It's also that kamikaze spirit and approach to the game that is Steve's greatest weakness. The most improbable stat from Steve Nash is how few games he has missed in the last few years. I have seen the pain he goes through before, during and after games, yet he still manages to trot out there and play at an incredibly high level. Our feeling was that we were fortunate that Steve had been so injury-free, that it was only a matter of time before his style of play caught up with him." Okay man, So basically what we've gathered is Nash was going to cost a lot, and whatever Mavs management thought they were seeing behind the scenes led them to believe they'd be tying up too much money in a guard who ultimately wouldn't deliver. I tend to think it was a combo of that, and seeing the 04 roster was clearly too deficient to contend. Maybe planning to use the money to build something more solid around Dirk going forward. Did Cuban overthink it? Doesn't matter. The result was letting one of the game's greatest point guards ever land straight in their backyard with a rival, in what the prideful owner now calls his biggest mistake ever. In hindsight, he's just extremely lucky Dirk was who he was, because we'd seen similar decisions lead to premature exits like when McGrady soured on Orlando. Dirk and Nash were the best of friends, and imagine finishing their careers together. Nowitzki wasn't even cool with it shortly afterward. Quote, "We were talking about it, and Dirk was like, how could you let Nash go?" And I went through it. You know, our coach and the doctors were like, we don't know how much longer he's gonna last. His minutes were down and this and that. I made him a good offer. The Suns made him a better offer. Mistakes aside, Dallas were now headed to the middle of the 2000s with no star point guard, no duo partner for Dirk outside of a 31-year-old Finley, and likely great confusion on where a roster who just placed near the bottom of the league in defense was headed. Well, West waits for nobody. It was time to get on doing the building around Dirk he had in mind. Dallas sent Antoine Jamison to Washington for Jerry Stackhouse and rookie point guard Devin Harris. They then sent Antoine Walker to Atlanta for Jason Terry. Assuring Nowitzki wouldn't get stuck again as the lone big presence down low, more assets were used to acquire big man Eric Dampier, rounding out your 2005 Steve Nash-less Dallas Mavs. It went very well. Dirk made his highest appearance on the MVP ballots yet, placing third behind Shaq, who'd been dealt east to Miami, and yeah, Steve Nash. Steve Nash won the MVP award in his very first season away from Dallas, while also playing 75 games. His incredible season also catapulted Phoenix to the league's best record at 62 wins, a few games above the 58-win, third-seeded Mavericks. While Finley was clearly aging, Stackhouse eventually overcame injuries to add a scoring punch and rank in 6 Man of the Year voting. Sophomore Josh Howard continued to up his contributions on both sides of the ball, providing a legitimate defensive presence on the perimeter, and Jason Terry did well enough filling in as PG. Although Mark had already clearly made a massive mistake, he did live up to his promise of building properly around his young star big, with the Mavs returning to a top 10 team in both offense and defense. The disappearance of the Lakers dynasty helped too. Only San Antonio's remained intact, while there was a fairly obvious grudge match on the horizon with their former star point guard. Not before a bit of NBA history I feel nobody remembers, however. Sure, the baptism that took place, which is likely one of McGrady's only memorable playoff moments, is etched inside the brain of any 2000s NBA fan. Does anybody remember the potential fix though? Because everyone seems to remember the next one in 06. However, the Mavs Rockets first round here was practically named as one of the victim series. Well, Team 3 lost the first 2 games in the series, and Team 3's owner complained to the NBA officials. Team 3's owner alleged that referees were letting a Team 4 player get away with illegal screens. NBA executive Y told referee supervisor Z that the referees for that game were to enforce the screening rules strictly against that Team 4 player. The referees followed the league's instructions, and Team 3 came back from behind to win the series. The NBA benefited from this because it prolonged the series, resulting in more tickets sold and more televised games. This came from the whole Tim Donaghy scandal. Adding insult, Jeff Van Gundy, coaching Houston at the time, was fined $100,000 for suggesting refs were out to get Yao Ming. It was the largest fine handed down to a coach in NBA history. "He's been calling and calling about Yao," said Van Gundy of Mark Cuban. "You got to give the guy credit. He's taken a lot of fines in his time. He's been on them hard. He's gotten the benefit. Before Game 3, I got a call from another official in the NBA who's not in the playoffs that I've known forever, and he told me they were looking at Yao harder because of Mark's complaints. It proved prophetic really the last couple of games. I didn't think that really worked in the NBA, but in this case, it has." If you've ever found yourself wondering where all the David Stern tyrant memes came from, quote, "If he's going to say things like that, he's not going to continue in this league," Stern said. "If the attitude reflected in those comments continues to be public, he's going to have a big problem with me as long as I'm commissioner." You want to take a guess on which teams Van Gundy coached after Houston? Yeah. Well, regardless of what you're into in terms of conspiracies, the Mavs stormed back and won the 7th game by 40, setting them up with a storybook match against the Suns. Let's have a chat. For as much as Nash's MVP years are criticized, specifically for the stats in hindsight, you can really tell who actually saw him and who didn't. Because one thing Nash didn't have an issue doing when he needed to was scoring. Case in point, through the first 3 games of the 05 semis, Phoenix led 2-1 behind Nash, averaging 14 assists a game, getting everyone involved as this unit thrived on. Naturally, you'd assume if you could force him to be a scorer and shut the water off for the Stoudemires and Marions, well, you fare much better. In theory. In practice, Nash walked Dallas down in the final 3 matches to the tune of 40 points a game on 60, 58, 100 shooting splits. Excuse me, not just what the fuck? The MVP disposed of his former doubting team with series averages of 30 points, 12 assists, and 7 rebounds. I'd have loved to be a fly on the wall of Mark Cuban's office in 2005. Dallas was great, but just like many before them, they'd simply fall into another great West unit. And it was around this time people had to be wondering if they'd ever get over the hump. San Antonio would go on to add its 3rd title, showing the conference was not letting up despite the lack of Shaq. Even if they could eventually beat Phoenix, did they have anything for Timmy and company? Oh, they had bigger problems and didn't even know it yet. Although he remained GM of the Mavs after stepping down as coach for Avery Johnson in March of 2005, Don Nelson had reportedly quietly lost interest in the Mavericks after they failed to retain Nash, which is of course conflicting with the stories of his departure, but whatever, nobody wants to be responsible for the fumble, I get it. The man who'd known Dirk inside and out since his days in Europe was already in motion to another franchise, and Dallas would have one more chance to avoid catastrophe. 2006 feels like one of the few NBA years from my childhood that people still mention regularly. For Dallas, it was the official separator from a team trying desperately to scale the mountain to a team and star now square in the spotlight of ridicule. The roster mostly improved organically, with Terry, Howard, and Marquise Daniels all seeing increased offensive roles. Stackhouse, Dampier, and Devin Harris all ranked in the 6th Man of the Year race. And then there was the curious signing of Sagana Diop. One thing we hadn't discussed so far is while Mark's reservations on Nash likely led to the fumbling of multiple championships, he generally had no problem shelling out cash for bigs. $70 million over 7 years for Rafe LaFrance, 7 years, $73 million for Eric Dampier. Sean Bradley also retired with plenty of cash left on his deal. Diop would come in and man a dual center rotation with Dampier, fully assuring Dirk wouldn't be left holding the bag on defense. Or at least they thought, you'll see. But this year, his nearly 2 blocks per game were more than enough as Dallas fans replaced the lyrics to the song Jump with Diop. Surprisingly though, they'd finally lost Michael Finley after 9 seasons, to San Antonio of all places. Wanting to avoid the luxury tax under the new CBA, management used the amnesty clause to waive him after being unable to trade him, preferring to send him anywhere other than their rivals. He could have chosen Miami, could have reunited with Nash and Phoenix, but the allure of that elusive title drew him to the dynasty, and a team who'd proven they could do it regularly. After many years, Dirk was now completely isolated from his friends and co-stars he'd shown up with, sporting a roster with no clear replacements. Somehow, this didn't matter. The slight tweaks netted them another 60-win season, of course, placing them behind San Antonio as the script usually demanded. Only this time the Spurs were all they truly had to contend with. 2006 was actually one of the least formidable years of the West by comparison, and this was further solidified in October when Amari Stoudemire went down with microfracture surgery. Nash was incredible. Nash was not a lone wolf, and without his superstar big, Phoenix could still win games, which earned him a 2nd straight controversial MVP. A championship or even emerging from the West, however, wasn't realistic. Round 1 was an easy sweep of Gasol's Grizzlies. Then the semifinals were the Western Conference Finals, as with how the bracket worked out and division rules, the Spurs-Mavs 0-3 rematch would take place right here, right now. As expected, it was a classic. 6 of these 7 games went down to the wire, yet people probably wouldn't remember the Mavs had broken through to take a 3-1 lead, albeit a very flimsy one with how narrow the wins had been. Tangling with the defending champs, the series was far from over. This was further complicated by Jason Terry earning a suspension by punching none other than his former teammate Michael Finley in the groin. Remember, these rosters performed beautifully, yet they were not of the Nash and Finley ilk with automatic scorers and fill-ins next to Dirk. Terry's absence cracked the door for a 2nd straight Spurs win, where the defending champs now had their little brothers on the ropes, fielding a Game 7 on their home floor. If you've seen my Spurs doc, well, you know how this ends. Another incredible game San Antonio was likely about to win before Ginobili's blunder. Both Dirk and Duncan were having a series for the ages, with the stakes fairly clear. Either a Stoudemire-less Phoenix team or a Clippers roster not actually ready for primetime were waiting at the finish line. Nowitzki poured in 37 points, 15 rebounds, and the clutchest shot of his career up to that point to defeat the defending Dynasty Spurs at home. Unbelievable feat, and a clear reason to believe his and their time had finally arrived. They were going to the finals. Save for some unforeseen blunder, after many long years of heartbreak, existing at a very tough time in the West, and questionable management decisions which kind of got swept under the rug, they were going to go to the finals without even having a 2nd star on the roster. Let's talk about that. We've been over it. Cuban kept his word, using Nash's absence to build solid support beams around his younger star. Okay, but we haven't discussed some of the misses which were probably stinging by now without an NBA Finals appearance to show for. After LA fell out in 04, Shaq initially had Dallas as a trade destination, specifically wanting to play with Dirk. Great timing too, as you know, this was right after Dirk got screwed into playing center for a year. In an interview speaking to Shaq, Cuban remarked, "We tried a bunch of different ways. We tried to trade for you. We tried to get you released. We tried to get you through somebody else so they would release you. Then I could sign you, and then you end up with those motherfuckers down in Florida, which pissed me off." The worst part about it is, Mickey Arison is smart. He did pretty much the exact same deal that we were proposing to do. It was not funny at all. If you happen to be wondering just how hard they were pulling for this, from Shaq, I called Mark and I said, "Whatever you gotta do to get me there, do it." And he's like, "The Lakers won't do it." And I was like, "Make them do it, Mark." They wouldn't do it, but that would have been nice because I love Dallas. As you know, I have 2 houses there. Yeah, the Lakers got a front row seat to Shaq for years. They weren't about to send him somewhere else in the West to block their own future paths. Fair enough. Unfortunately, after they predictably disposed of the hampered Suns, Shaq was waiting on the other side, with what at the time appeared to be the second coming of Michael Jordan by his side. The Suns series is still worth a mention. They actually won Game 1 by 3 and had the series tied through 4, to which I'll assume Dallas faithful were having heart attacks. Losing to them in 05 healthy was one thing. Here with Boris Diaw being their leading scorer, no disrespect to Diaw, Phoenix were proving to be a great team with Nash performing miracles. The loss still would have been crazy. The Dallas Mavericks had avoided total meltdown, and after 26 years of existence, had been granted their first ever NBA Finals trip. Oh, the road ahead was so rocky. I was surprised to learn that in hindsight, people who didn't experience this firsthand were surprised the Mavs were favorites. Okay, it ain't too surprising, I guess. Nearly 20 years later, one roster is 1000% more recognizable than the other. Living through it wasn't the same. We didn't know D-Wade's body of work yet. Shaq and virtually every older star you see there wasn't really what their names implied anymore. It was a roster hammered together by Riley to get the job done as quickly as possible. Dallas, on the other hand, was younger, had defenders and scorers, a very established superstar, depth, and home court advantage. Home court advantage they used to jump out to an early, strong 2-0 lead where they appeared to be cruising to an easy title as expected. Part of it was how they'd minimize Shaq, being completely unwilling to allow him to get comfortable and in his old ways. After the first 2 games, he recalls, "I did something that I hadn't done with D-Wade and the guys all year, curse him out. Because I was having a terrible finals. I was getting fronted, back hit, side. Avery Johnson made a conscious effort that I wasn't going to beat him. So I finally went off on Gary Payton, I went off on Wade, I went off on Antoine Walker. What the fuck are y'all gonna do? Like, we couldn't make an entry pass, and when I got it, I couldn't make my move. I was older. It just wasn't working. And D-Wade was open a lot, so I was like, what you gonna do? You wanna be a star? You wanna be like Kobe and LeBron? This is your time." I mean, he was a great team player. He always looked for me first, a lot of times too much. But that was the first time we gave him permission. Fuck Shaq, go to work. Fuck Shaq turned out to be some of the greatest NBA Finals advice of all time. Miami came out at home with the typical energy a team with their backs against the wall normally does. The concerning part was, even with the Zenkai boost, their lead had not only been erased, but turned into a 13-point deficit with 6.5 minutes remaining in regulation. Nothing would ever be the same afterward. Anytime this series comes up, I try to convey how over it was by this point. Even before Game 3, the Mavs championship celebration plans had leaked from a Dallas newspaper. That's how much dirt the world had already shoveled onto Miami. There was simply no chance an underdog with old role players and an inexperienced third-year star was getting out of this one. Then Wade happened. And controversy. To this day, Mark Cuban calls it the worst officiated final series of all time, where Wade shot free throw after free throw, grinding Dallas down over the course of the next 4 matches. The funny part is, through the Game 3 collapse, Wade had only gotten fouled twice on the way to squeaking out a 2-point victory. From Spoelstra, in those 6 minutes, that has become what we know as Dwayne Wade. He became an absolute force of nature. In my 21 years, I can't name 5 guys that can command and impose a will on a game on both ends of the court like Dwayne Wade did in those final minutes, where he's literally running to the ball defensively and trying to make every single play, a charge, a block, a rebound, a disruption, mess up the timing on the play, and then offensively making every single play and making the plays that everybody thinks are the toughest shots in the league. In short, those 6 minutes literally broke Dallas. Imagine your owner already being on TV talking about parade routes, then as you're mentally popping champagne, you get hit with one of the greatest finals performances of all time to block your 3-0 lead. Miami believed they were better now, and it didn't help for confidence that the game ended for Dallas on a self-admitted defensive breakdown, followed by their legend missing a free throw. Dallas had every chance, they simply did not seize it. The same can be said for Game 4, where the Heat continued their momentum and turned it into their only blowout win of the series. This one was getting away fast. In accordance, Avery Johnson not only took his team out of Miami and sent them to a hotel in Fort Lauderdale to get them away from temptation, he made them bunk in rooms as roommates. It was just all going bad. Then there was the subplot about how during the playoffs, Nowitzki would hum David Hasselhoff songs to himself at the free throw line. Miami's crowd used it to basically bully him, a detail practically lost in NBA history because it happened before social media. Jerry Stackhouse had also gotten himself suspended for a pivotal Game 5, which was to take place in Miami, with the old format garnering 3 straight home games. Kinda crazy looking back. Here, Dwayne Wade shot 25 free throws, which matched the Mavs team total. The blitz included the famous phantom call at the end, which gave Wade a chance to take the lead. To make matters worse, Josh Howard folded under pressure and called their final timeout, leaving them unable to advance the ball for a clear shot at the end. Even now, both sides disagree about the legitimacy of 2006 Wade. Of course, Miami tells it that an unstoppable player put his head down nearly every play, blowing by defenders who had no choice but to foul. Dirk once said, the less he'd say about the series, the better, though in another interview, he admits they couldn't keep themselves in front of him. At this point, I just implore, especially younger fans, to go watch the games. They are available. I watched it live. I've watched it back since, and have always felt it was like a lot of basketball. Some calls were questionable for sure, but boy, the way the narrative has just ignored his speed and ability to slash and force so many of those fouls has been egregious. Also very egregious to not point out the numerous chances Dallas had when they were in great position. The first 2 home wins would become their last, as Cuban's crew suffered one of the most heartbreaking defeats you'll ever see. Years and years of tinkering with the roster, overcoming mistakes and missed opportunities, scaling the Western Conference, who, by the way, very much still had the same issues to deal with for any championship hopeful going forward. Would they even be able to muster up the will to do it again one day? Oh, they also had even bigger problems than just the usual ones. There's always 2 ways a massive heartbreak can go in the league. The team uses it as motivation to do the impossible a year later, or the team never recovers. With some very light retooling, Dallas returned with the same confidence of a unit who literally had Larry O'Brien in its hands. To be honest, beating San Antonio was all the vouch they needed for another run. Except, recall a small detail earlier. Don Nelson had not only lost interest in it all, he was now ready to just move on totally. On August 30th, 2006, Nelly was named head coach of the Golden State Warriors, after manning a very successful tenure within Dallas Maverick operations. Most notably, helping discover and safely deliver Dirk to the city all those years ago. He'd scouted his talent, helped him develop, led his teams to winning seasons. If there was one man who knew the Mavs, and especially Dirk, it was Nelly. No big deal though, right? Of course not, because as usual, Dallas found ways to improve without rocking the boat too much. Dirk became the MVP, desperate not to let the failure of 06 define him. Josh Howard made an all-star team after suffering a moment embarrassing enough to ruin most young careers. Devin Harris became a full-time starter and excelled, while the rest of the roster continued to hold adequate support. They didn't just improve on the former 61 season as they'd hoped, they'd smashed it, winning 67 games and holding every bit of the energy that had taken them through the West, and shoulder to shoulder with the title. The Suns and Spurs remain hot on their trails as usual, yet there shouldn't have been much else in the conference to seriously worry about. Even better, the Eastern Conference, as had been known through these years, had hit rock bottom with the defending champion Heat struggling to put a healthy or coherent product on the floor. Following them, there was no roster who could really hold a candle anymore to any of these 3 West juggernauts, meaning whoever emerged was probably going to become champion. Perfect chance, all set up for the MVP to commence a comeback story. Damn. In the very waning weeks of the season, the Clippers and Warriors' last couple of games would literally determine who had the honor of the 8th seed. At a record of 42-40, Golden State just narrowly edged it out, although this record truly spoke nothing of their potential. Headed into the postseason from March 5th, they posted a record of 16-6. It wasn't even until mid-January when they traded for Al Harrington and Steven Jackson, extremely vital pieces to what was coming. Still, what was coming totally blindsided the world, as Dallas had spent the last few years worried about much larger characters like Tim Duncan, other MVPs. Golden State was cool, but it'd just be a matter of time before the Mavs were rematching old foes later in the bracket. Then Game 1 in Dallas happened. What? Okay, actually not what. We've seen random upsets before, especially in game ones. It's what makes playoff series so great. You have to really beat a team to eliminate them, and if injuries aren't present, you were probably just better or played better by the end of it if you did. There was no way this makeshift Warriors roster was capable, and well, maybe they wouldn't have been if it weren't for Coach Nelson. You know we're gonna beat Dallas. That's the first thing he said, Matt Barnes recalled while reminiscing on 07. It wasn't just hot air either. I implore you to go back and watch this series also from start to finish, because having Dirk's profile, Nelson deployed the most brutal targeting of a superstar I think I've ever seen. I took time to rewatch it myself over summer, as I really only remembered the hype and news surrounding it when I was a kid. Oh my goodness. These 100% smothered threes Dirk nailed when they were basically already down 3-1 might be the best, most comfortable looks he got all series. Seriously, Nelly ran smaller, quicker defenders at him anytime it even looked like the ball was coming his way. Double teams, active hands, switching, scrambling. Literally whatever it took to bother him is exactly what he had his squad do. Oh, it didn't stop there. On offense, they targeted him. It was one thing to have him as a rim protector in 04. Here, they simply made him slide those slow feet, and if he couldn't, well, this ahead of its time Warriors lineup exploited him. He couldn't stay in front of anyone. He really couldn't take many plays off either. Dallas couldn't hide him. Anytime he touched the floor the entire series, he had to be thinking at lightning speed on both sides of the ball, or Dallas paid the price. When it was said and done, he'd finished with averages of 19.7 points, shot just 38% from the field and 21% from three. An extreme far cry from the numbers that won him MVP and led his team to nearly 70 victories. It might be the worst showing of any MVP in a series ever. It's not just the numbers. Go watch it. He looked totally defeated, as if he just didn't even have a clue of how to overcome the schemes. It wasn't just as simple as his teammates needing to step up either. They folded too. The only perimeter player to even shoot over 50% from the field was Josh Howard. The quickness of Golden State and the confusion their strategy caused led to frustration from everyone in a Mavericks thread, as they turned the ball over, played with no momentum, and also couldn't hit shots. All in all, it was the greatest domination of a 1 seed from an 8 seed probably ever, and it helped nothing when Dirk was made to accept his award in a press conference after elimination. Yikes. It's the part of Dirk and Dallas' story I try to convey for people who weren't there. Around this time, in basketball discourse, they looked extremely funny in the light, and specifically Dirk. Their loud, boisterous, and complaining owner had more disappointment than anything to show for so far. Nowitzki was fastly approaching 30 and was beginning to look like a fraud who had a beautiful game, but couldn't lead a team to a title. Even worse, with 2 straight monumental collapses in a row, it was beginning to look more likely they'd be one of the many West teams who just never broke through over the 2000s. Oh yeah, their counterparts in San Antonio added insult by progressing to easily win the title, their 3rd in 5 years and 4th overall. If anything, this was probably the worst part. Forget routine failure. Timmy was another legendary big who was getting it done by any means necessary. Better team? Sure. But he hadn't suffered a single blemish comparable to what happened to Dirk so far, while directly contributing to his team's success each and every time. It's no wonder they began to swing for the fences, which they were very nearly successful at, by the way. By summer 07, Kobe had had enough of his front office without Shaq. He wanted to win as a number 1, but that didn't mean going years with below subpar talent. He appeared ready to move on, and just as Cuban had tried with his co-star once, he got to work trying to patch up the obvious hole Nash had left. It was done. He called Dirk to tell him it was done. The Mavs would be sending Jason Terry, all-star Josh Howard, and draft picks to Los Angeles for Kobe Bean Bryant. 2 of the West's most revered players were about to join forces again at a time where there were still only a few real contenders. Just like in 06, they were ready to pop champagne until Mitch Kupchak notified Mark how they talked Kobe off the ledge. Oh my goodness. I don't even need to explain the tear those two were about to go on for the next 4 years or so. Instead, midway through 08, Kobe got another versatile star big and the rest was truly history for the time being. Dallas may as well not even have existed from 08 to 2010 compared to what they'd done shortly beforehand. True, for the entire 2000s, Dirk was extremely impressive and they won 50 games or more each year. Still, it was as if 07 had just taken the wind out of them. With the numerous improvements taking place around the league, Dirk and a cast of emerging or established role players was no longer cutting it. He hadn't had a true second star since Nash departed, and he felt the absence each of these next 3 seasons. The following moves felt as if they were on the margin, as Cuban was able to bring Jason Kidd back midway through 08, although it was a much less electric 34-year-old Kidd. This would matter more later than it did in the present. They suffered a swift gentleman's sweep to a new potential power out west in Chris Paul's Hornets, so not only could they not defeat the old guard consistently, the future was passing them up right before their eyes. This says nothing of the fact Kobe and Gasol had proved powerful enough to even leapfrog San Antonio. In 2009, they overtook a wilting Spurs team in round 1 just to run into Melo's Nuggets, who were also now probably good enough for a title if Kobe didn't exist. By 2010, there was actually reason to be slightly nervous. For one, I just speed ran these couple of years because A, they'd have never beaten Kobe and Gasol regardless, and B, the roster barely changed at all. This was significant because with summer 2010 on the horizon, nearly every consequential star had a chance to look elsewhere, including Dirk. Dallas partly prepared for this with a midseason trade acquiring Caron Butler, only to run into San Antonio again in round 1 and be sent packing. Funny enough, I remember this being the season I actually believed they'd make a run. Quiet as kept, they'd also made some low-key important moves such as signing Shawn Marion and continuing to develop JJ Barea. Was it going to be enough though? The worst kept secret in the league at the time was LeBron and a host of other stars were about to set themselves up in better situations. By this point, despite not missing any games, Dirk had begun to tack on some random wear and tear injuries, and the roster didn't necessarily look close to actually contending given the recent results. Good? Certainly, as always, just not better than the units regularly showing up in the finals. For this reason, it was very slightly nerve-wracking for Dallas faithful when he declined his player option and became an unrestricted free agent for the first time in his career. Although, as I remember it and as I found, they were never under any serious threat of him leaving. They just also weren't any serious threat in the market. They only blipped as a dark horse in the LeBron sweepstakes, as they would have had to pull a magical sign-and trade to convince him to come play with a stagnant roster and aging Dirk. While it also seems they got meetings with other players, their win for 2010 would just be retaining their hometown hero. What of their contention chances though? On July 13th, 2010, they'd make their only other moves of the summer, signing Ian Mahinmi and trading with the Bobcats for Tyson Chandler. If you were paying attention, very slowly and quietly over the course of a year, they'd nearly completed a championship team without all the glitz and glamour, and nobody even knew it because we truly left them in 2007 by now. Under more silence, they added free agent Brian Cardinal, free agent Peja Stojakovic, and free agent Corey Brewer. If you were a fan around the time, we were all guilty of paying more attention to the giant splashes we've seen everywhere else, most notably in Miami, which had very much appeared to be the end of parity. Meanwhile, Dallas retained their superstar, had shooting, defense, versatility, depth, size, just about anything you'd need for a long playoff run. But why would anyone trust them now when they'd seemingly choked all their best chances away when Dirk was young? Also, with the last champions having been super teams or superstar duo pairings, we'd entered an era where you were thought to need multiple stars to win. Dallas remained with only one. The move a year earlier for Caron Butler was excellent, however, and could make them a headache for anybody. Except, he tore his patellar tendon after 29 games, zapping their second best perimeter scorer from existence without a trace. They were back to being no more than a solid team some contender would have to pass on the way to a title. A contender like the repeat champion Los Angeles Lakers, who were hot on the trails of another three-peat for Phil Jackson, who'd famously only won his championships in threes. Oh buddy. Of course, we've got the benefit of hindsight, but I'll at least say the signs were there. While the world was infatuated with the Celtics and Heat, with either presumably being shoo-ins to face Kobe in the finals, Dallas had tied Los Angeles in the standings with 57 wins, placing behind only San Antonio. Again, here's why we didn't see them coming though. While they swept their season series against Miami and Boston, which was only 2 games apiece, 5 of their losses on the season were from both San Antonio and LA, to which they lost both season series. The story was the same as always. Dallas was really good, just likely not better than the best of their conference, who they'd have to scale to even get to the Eastern Challengers. So, let's also talk about how there was zero confidence inspired through their first round against the flailing Trailblazers. Sure, a good team, except they were practically the remnants of a core who'd failed to reach its potential through multiple injuries. Brandon Roy was on his last breath, and he used it in an inspiring flash of what he once was to tie the series through 4. If you weren't there, this was literally no surprise to us, as we were flat out used to being able to ignore 50-win Maverick seasons. Those were just a given. They weren't making any runs. They narrowly managed to avoid another upset, disposing of Portland over the next 2. Dirk had a monster series, gearing up for the real test against Kobe and company. Take a long, hard look at these odds, and what experts were saying about this one. Dallas, who'd rarely ever actually beaten their most challenging foes, up against another Laker dynasty desperately trying to get Kobe his 6th to match Jordan. Most of us would have bet anything this wouldn't take too long, and it didn't. Just not how we thought. By the beginning of the third of Game 1, it all looked exactly how we expected. LA led by 16 on their home floor, establishing dominance as the actual contenders the way they and the Spurs had so often throughout the last decade. Then you blinked, and by the end, Kobe was missing a potential game-winning shot, faltering on their home floor in a way we had not seen since 2008. Dirk had poured in 28 points and 14 rebounds with some clutch baskets, snatching much-needed home court advantage. NBA history is really so fragile. I'd wager to say if they'd gone on to continue being blown out, we'd have probably seen the same story we always had with them. Not this time. Dallas continued to shock the world by taking LA apart over and over again, blowing them out in Game 2, putting them in the unsolvable situation, having lost both home games. You never lose both home games. By that point, the momentum is too far gone and you're flat out expected to lose, which they would do, brutally. In a series virtually nobody picked them to win, Dirk and company had swept the defending champion Dynasty Lakers, ending Phil Jackson's coaching career and really Kobe Bryant's as we knew it. After 3 long years at the top of the West, they finally could no longer hold on. In the closeout game, Mark Cuban requested fans not bring brooms to the arena, clearly having learned a lesson from years earlier. You could see how dialed in they were from the top this time. The Game 4 thrashing might be the most brutal way a repeat champion has ever died. The barrage of threes eventually triggering Andrew Bynum to flat out put JJ Barea in danger. It was all representative of how shell-shocked we all were. Dirk averaged 25 and 9 while shooting 72% from 3, only on 11 attempts, but he made them count. The final test to scale the West would not be San Antonio, who'd fallen by way of an upset in round 1. It was the newcomers instead, an OKC team who everyone had seen on the horizon for a couple years now. They weren't ready. A good team with greatness in their future, their stars hadn't fully developed, nor had the supporting cast. Dallas used its size and veteran experience to finish some close matches in a gentleman's sweep, where Nowitzki crafted his best masterclass of the run so far with 32 points a game on 56%. After 5 long years, miraculously, they were going to get another shot at it. Totally blindsided us all. They'd suffered losses, roster stagnation, injury, the Western Conference. It'd gotten so hung up at a point, the biggest story of their season was Mark Cuban beefing with Kenyon Martin and his mother during a series they got cooked in. Under today's circumstances, a star of Dirk's stature would have left already. Well, he would have requested a trade, but definitely left in free agency for a shot where he could actually get something done. He instead trusted the process, and without any fanfare, let his front office build something good enough to do the job ahead. They were not good enough to do the job ahead. Miami had turned into a buzzsaw late in the season, chomping through everything put in their path. The rough start turned into the highlight machine we all expected, crunching their way to the NBA Finals with ease. The trio of Wade, Bosh, and James had proven to be as unstoppable as everybody thought it would. Dallas had beaten normal teams so far. Great teams, just not young superstar trios who could demoralize you after a couple fast breaks. Virtually anywhere you look, Miami was winning predictions in landslides, with a few people here and there breaking down why they thought the trio wouldn't be enough to be a more complete team. I'm glad this part of history has never been successfully rewritten, because Miami was supposed to win. Of course, Dallas was deeper. Did they or anyone have answers for so much star power at once though? They didn't in Game 1, where LeBron and Wade shared responsibility, rounding out the game with soul-crushing highlights which were pretty indicative of where it was obviously headed. The plays were so loud, we kind of ignored how Bosh hadn't played well, and the contributions outside of Wade and James could be some cause for concern. They weren't for most of Game 2, as they kept their foot on the necks of a more balanced team, simply out-talenting them for much of the match. It all came to a head with Wade's 3 in the 4th, which had likely put it out of reach, and everyone knew it. The superstar pairing boasted. They survived all the hate, all the adversity, and were well on their way to winning one of many championships, as they said. They just carried around a little too much swagger. Funny enough, if you read the oral history of the 06 finals, this was nearly the same vibe when Miami was about to be down for the count and they saw the Mavs bench celebrating, which gave Wade his sense of urgency, at nearly the same exact timestamp as well, crazy enough. For the next 6.5 minutes, Dallas left everything they had on the floor. They were no dummies, their season was on the line here. Going down 0-2 to this squad would have felt a lot more like 0-3. Through incredible shot making and defense, they set themselves up for possibly the most legendary moment of Dirk's career.
7 to shoot. Nowitzki drives with underneath lefty layup, banks it in with 3.6 remaining. Miami out of timeouts, trailing by 2. James back to Wade. Wade puts it up for the win. Off the mark, and Dallas has tied the finals.
You could actually feel the air get sucked out of the arena. Mike Breeden's voice, the looks on Heat player faces, the swift silencing of the crowd. Something not a single person would have bet on just 20 minutes ago had unfolded right before their eyes. Dallas was taking this back home tied, with 3 straight games on their home floor waiting. It was far from over, yet some cracks had shown for Miami, and they actually mattered this time. James had only scored 20 points. Mike Bibby outscored Chris Bosh, who'd had another poor shooting night, and there really wasn't a ton of support elsewhere. Were the Heat actually that much better? They were good enough to edge out a classic Game 3, breaking the momentum which could have carried Dallas to a gentleman's sweep, assuring the series would at least finish in Miami. Still, this was clearly a ship taking on water. LeBron had once again only scored 17 points, and in a close series, the habits being built were not great. He didn't just choke as history remembers it. Sure, there was definitely a good bit of mental strife going on up there, as evidenced by Wade having to get on him during the game, something we'd never seen. But Dallas zoned him out of existence. For years, he'd created these superhuman highlights, barreled through any defense in his way, though he'd never won for the same reason. Like in 2010 when he slowly shrank against Boston. This time he had help, yet the zone still necessitated decision making, pushing him into a more passive role with his new star teammates. With that, as Golden State had done to Dirk so many years ago, Dallas showed him body after body, throwing anyone who could walk at him, as evidenced by that one picture you've probably seen over the years. By Game 4, this had resulted in an 8-point night on 3 of 11 from the field. If he'd given them anything more, it'd have likely overtaken the 3-point victory and sent Miami to the 3-1 promised land with at least 2 chances at home to finish the job. No cigar. By the way, Dirk was sick in Game 4. Not the performance and clutch shots at the end, like actually sick, with a fever north of 100 the night before the game. After having collapsed twice now and allowing the series to be tied, here's what LeBron and Wade thought of the situation.
Oh, did y'all hear me cough? Think I'm sick.
Hey, this weather, man.
Weather is crazy.
It's hard to go from 85-degree weather and then go to 90.
What on earth were they thinking? Actually, this was just the vibe of the 2011 Heat, dating back to the opening party. This specific version of them just didn't respect their competition. They were so full of themselves and so sure they just put the league in a headlock. LeBron was smack dab in the middle of posting his second disappointing finals performance and chose to get on camera with his boy and take very obvious shots. Most confusing moment ever, and it ended exactly how it would in a movie. Dirk went on to play even better for the Game 5 victory, giving them the chance to patch up old wounds in South Beach. They would capitalize. I couldn't believe what I was watching. The Dallas Mavs of all teams I'd kept up with through the years had not only defeated the new Big Three, they walked all over them. Nowitzki, who 4 years earlier was looking like the softest superstar of this generation, had flat out manhandled the trio, who were all getting more attention than him in the late 2000s. No one saw it coming, and he himself even had to walk back to the locker room in disbelief, seemingly unable to understand the magnitude of what he just accomplished. KD and Westbrook, Kobe and Gasol, the Heatles, with averages of 26 points, 10 rebounds, and 40 minutes a game at times battling sickness, he'd officially capped off one of, if not the greatest individual playoff run of all time. Dallas was a great team, but I'm nearly certain they'd have struggled to make the playoffs without him. Caron Butler wasn't even present. That's a whole nother perimeter body and scorer who would have affected things on both sides. This run and the humbling of a team who'd spoken way too much way too soon almost completely erased Nowitzki's past failures from memory. Never again would anyone really discuss how he had to give an MVP speech after being humiliated by an 8th seed. Never again would anyone talk about how many times he'd fallen to Tim Duncan. Winning his first championship in dominant fashion against a team and player who'd robbed him of the chance before. Never again would anyone talk about 06 concerning him in any way that actually mattered. The job was finished. Literally. It was so finished, in fact, he would later admit to kind of exhaling and not knowing what to do or what to chase next after such a grueling road to the top. He didn't necessarily need to worry about it either. The first problem was the upcoming lockout, which affected each team differently, but a championship unit already has enough to deal with trying to defend a title. A sped up schedule on aging legs wasn't going to be too friendly. Problem 2 was, in a deviation from the past, Mark Cuban deciding not to pay big man Tyson Chandler. What? Nah, not what at all. This is actually one of the easiest transactions in recent history to understand. The lockout meant a new CBA. Long story short, giving Chandler the contract he wanted would have tied Dallas's finances up for the next few years between him, aging Dirk, and aging Shawn Marion. They then likely would have had to find cheaper replacements for everyone else they lost, including damn near the entire recognizable supporting cast. I will also remind you this is around the time names like Dwight Howard were floating around. It was truly a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. The 2011 roster wasn't coming back one way or the other, and tying the money up in Chandler is something Cuban has remained adamant that he was right about not doing. It just wouldn't have been a smart future play, and very likely wouldn't have won anything in the present. Yeah, this is why the 2012 roster looks so much different, featuring faces such as Vince Carter, Delonte West, and Lamar Odom. Now, this might have been cool if it was Vince about 2 years earlier and Odom whose head wasn't completely out of the game on the heels of feeling betrayed by Los Angeles. Speaking of those two, here's how it was supposed to go. From Rick Carlisle at the time, right now, for me having Odom, Dirk Nowitzki, Shawn Marion, we may have the best forward trio in this league right now, and that's exciting. Lamar Odom is a guy we have great respect for as a person and as an all-around player in this league. We feel he's going to add so many different dimensions for us. Length, playmaking, scoring, experience, championship experience. And here's how it ended. From Odom. During one homestand, I was having possibly the worst game of the season. Rick subbed me out and I looked for a seat near the coaches, but none were available. So I went down to the only open seat at the end of the bench, right next to Cuban. Cuban extended his right foot and kicked my shin. "Come on, motherfucker," he shouted. I was stunned. This wasn't a tap, I felt it. That was the last straw. It was painfully clear he did not respect me as a man. I felt the adrenaline rush through my body. As I sprang up, Vince Carter, who was sitting next to me, grabbed my arm tightly and leaned in. "Lo, chill out," Vince calmly said. "Don't do it, it's not worth it." A physical confrontation with Cuban would have been the end of my career. A dark moment that I would have been remembered for despite being a two-time NBA champion. Yeah, if you experienced his stint in real life, it all makes sense. He went from possibly the best season of his career to a totally broken basketball player seemingly overnight, and while they weren't repeating one way or another, there was an attempt by Dallas to put something respectable out. Something respectable which Miami took the pleasure of completely trouncing on opening night. The Heatles led the entire game, going up 60-36 before the half was even up. It was a clear message. One, Dallas wasn't even really needing to receive. Their makeshift follow-up roster went 36-30 as Dirk battled knee issues and they fell to 8th, making easy work for the Thunder who had snatched the baton. Small price to pay though, right? Cuban essentially fed the 2012 season to the Wolves in hopes he could maximize what was left of Dirk with a huge splash. Dwight Howard's Orlando Magic debacle left him thinking he could sell him a winning team, meaning he'd had his eyes set on the big man since they won the title. Chris Paul also technically still hadn't committed long-term to the Clippers, meaning he was set to hit the market at the same time as Dwight. Summer 2013 was the first time Dallas had a real cap space since Cuban took over, and he intended to use it to plot the future. Problem: Paul was a perfect fit with Los Angeles, and I don't remember thinking there was a chance he'd leave so soon once he got there. Dirk was also now 34, and with Dallas having no championship cast, there were a few other places Howard could have had better long-term luck in, including the neighbors in Houston. Cuban had a plan, and boy was he furious when it fell apart. Obviously he made a mistake in judgment, Cuban said before facing Howard's Rockets. Do I blame him? No, that's what young kids do. They make mistakes in judgment. You choose teams, you don't choose players. If you made a choice off of an individual player, yeah, he made a mistake. You choose teams, you choose organizations, you choose coaches, and it's just not relative to Houston. That's just the way I look at it, because if he's that good, then the right organization... Man, between him kicking Odom and calling Howard a kid, I'm looking at him a little funny as an owner. Although many players around the league have vouched for what he's done organizationally. Here, he cooked absolutely nothing, and the 2013 Mavericks were an even worse version of their previous rendition, missing the postseason for the first time since he'd purchased the team. It's almost no coincidence this was also the year they finally lost Jason Terry. In further preparation for the coming summer, they declined to match Boston's contract offer. The Jet took off after 6 beloved years. Tyson Chandler once mentioned how he understood Cuban's idea, yet if the grand plot came up short, well, what was left? Nothing. The only moment even worth a mention in 2013 was Kobe completely folding them after Cuban publicly suggested Los Angeles should use the amnesty clause on Bryant to set things up better for the future. Hilariously, if you track the next events, he was actually right from a business standpoint, although morally you just don't do that. As far as future outlooks go, the worst part wasn't even missing out on Dwight. During draft night 2013, Mavs management took steps to clear space for him, trading the 13th pick to the Celtics for the 16th pick. As Cuban remembers it, they were definitely interested in Giannis, opting to pursue Howard harder since they had no time for a developing project. Ouch. Although, it low-key set them up for their next era of hoops. Mid-2010s Dallas basketball was damn near a blur, with very few notable moments and some funny ones in between. They bounced back to the playoffs a year later as the 8th seed, setting them up on a date with the Spurs again, as they were still contending for championships with the same core they were battling a decade ago. It was another near 50-win season. As mentioned earlier, they routinely spit those out whether they were title-worthy or not. Acquiring Monte Ellis helped them rebound very slightly, as they had almost no defensive chops at this point, still managing a top offense. It brought them face to face with potentially one of the greatest upsets ever, as Vince Carter's game winner put them up 2-1 with another home game left. If anything, it was just another testament to the West. Sure, they weren't contending, yet they'd have placed third in the East with 49 wins and possibly been the second best team there. It was a nice vote of confidence to have come so close to eliminating the eventual champions who'd go on to win in dominant fashion, and gave reason to believe there was still time to get Dirk within striking distance of another. In preparation, they gave Chandler Parsons an offer sheet which wasn't matched. To make up for never having signed Dwight Howard, they refilled their center position with Tyson Chandler. He'd gone to New York, won a Defensive Player of the Year, and was now on his way back via trade. This was less about admitting his move in 2011 was wrong and more about just rebounding from the failed plot. It was a solid-looking roster, who by December 19th held a record of 19-8, just refusing to go away with Dirk now 36 years old, yet still contributing on a team with a good bit of firepower. This is when they decided to pull the trigger for championship point guard Rajon Rondo, who was clearly going to need good teams to run with to actually affect winning. He would have it here. What he wouldn't have was fit. Dallas's offense relied a lot on spacing, which he provided none of. He wasn't quite the same player after the ACL injury, and his personality completely clashed with the coach, who some have described as a bit of an authoritarian. It wasn't the first NBA personality he didn't mesh with leading to issues, except these issues flat out boiled over. While they once again still managed 50 wins and a 7th seed, the roster looked much better on paper than it was capable of being in the postseason. In round 1, it just all fell apart for good. Parsons, one of their top signings, would pick up knee troubles holding him out of all but one game in the Houston series, also foreshadowing pretty much the remainder of his career. Rondo, who'd already been suspended one game in February for butting heads with Carlisle, was benched in the second half of Game 2 after basically trying to get himself out of the game by fouling Harden multiple times. He didn't play the rest of the game, he didn't play the rest of the series. You can ask Rondo that, Carlisle told reporters when asked whether he actually wanted to play. All I know is, right now, we need everyone at their competitive best. Dallas had tried everything they could over the last of Dirk's productive years. Nothing was working, including their gambit over summer when they actually had a verbal agreement for DeAndre Jordan to come upgrade their center position. No cigar. The Clippers pulled every trick in the book to convince him to keep catching those Chris Paul lobs. Unreal. It was truly just time to start saying goodbye. The only thing Dallas had left was surrounding a now flat-out old Nowitzki with other over-the-hill role players. With the West moving on and new teams taking over, it was obvious the day was fast approaching where they'd have to open the next chapter. Kobe was retiring, Duncan, Dirk was getting caught on islands trying to stay in front of prime Steph Curry. It was time to start saying thank you. All the times he could have probably left or requested a trade, including 2014 when he was offered a contract by both Houston and Los Angeles, but trusted his original team to keep working, which they did try.
I'll tell you a story about Dirk. I mean, he was up for free agency, and I knew what his response was going to be, but just out of respect, I said, dude, everybody's looking around at all these free agents. I felt I'd just shoot you a text. If you want to come to LA, you know, and he goes, dude, I would love to play with you, but Dallas is my home. This is my team. I'm not leaving here. And so he and I think a lot alike in that regard.
By 2017, they were just missing the playoffs, and we began to wonder what he was even doing anymore, appearing to run on needles as his days wore down. Maybe he knew something we didn't. Yogi Ferrell. Although the 2018 Mavs would secure only 24 victories, their lowest total since drafting Dirk, a random 10-day guy in Ferrell would evoke Linsanity mentions when he went on a tear in early 2017. He became only the third undrafted rookie in NBA history to have a 30-point outing within his first 15 games, and tied a rookie record for three-pointers in a game, going 9 of 11. He won Rookie of the Month in February, and off a 10-day was able to achieve All-Rookie second team. Very short-lived tenure with Dallas, though a fun little subplot before they really got busy. We'd seen Luka Doncic before. Age 17, the scrawny kid playing against the Thunder in the global preseason games. Most probably weren't paying attention, which was part of the problem. Despite already having been a pro, his lack of college hoops led many to believe he couldn't be the real deal. There was DeAndre Ayton, the center evoking the term generational, which is really funny looking back because although we have the benefit of hindsight now, a big with a playstyle I wouldn't consider modern drawing so much ire was definitely interesting. Either way, he was basically the consensus first pick throughout the process. Meanwhile, other familiar names American fans actually kept up with remained high on the boards. Doncic slipped just a bit, as Phoenix took the bait and Sacramento opted not to take another guard just 1 year before taking another guard. With the third pick in the 2018 NBA draft, the Atlanta Hawks selected Luka Doncic, then traded him to Dallas for the fifth pick, Trae Young, and a future first rounder. Damn. Funny enough, Young just so happened to be one of the only semi-acceptable names ever you could have traded for Luka. It kind of worked out for both sides so far, kind of. Just like that, after missing Donovan Mitchell the previous year and years earlier passing up on Giannis for a dream, Dallas had finally gotten their guy. With Nowitzki's tank on E after nearly 20 years, he'd stick around just one more time to personally hand the keys of the franchise to a kid he actually wasn't even sure about at first. "I didn't think it was gonna be this kid," Nowitzki said recently. I'm not sure this is gonna work. Is he quick enough? Is he athletic enough to go by guys like he is in Europe? And so there were plenty of doubts there from everybody on the team. It sounds like he had the exact same reservations as many. Still, those went away almost immediately during training camp, before he shot out to 21 points, 8 rebounds, and 7 assists to capture Rookie of the Year. Funny enough, I remember back then saying he was low-key already a Hall of Fame shoo-in before he'd even played a game based on his overseas resume. If he added even a little, it just wasn't going to be that hard. The sentiment was met with the same bothered attitude that had people questioning his legitimacy in the first place. You could tell the hype bothered them. Regardless, at just 19 years old, it was clear. Sure, he wasn't super fast. Maybe the eye test was a bit confusing, yet the skill clearly translated. The roster was going to need to catch up quickly. There was no Steve Nash or anything comparable as a co-star already there and growing with him. Well, okay, actually on the same night, at pick 33, they did select Jalen Brunson, who didn't get off to a bad start himself in year 1. Oh, DeAndre Jordan wound up in Dallas as well finally, just not at his all-NBA level anymore. Mark wasted zero time. In February of Luka's first campaign, they'd acquired Kristaps Porzingis from New York in a surprise trade. Kristaps, who'd been dubbed a unicorn up north, and at times looked like one of the league's next great modern bigs. Though at the time of this trade, he was in the midst of missing a season due to a torn ACL, a huge red flag for a lanky, mobile 7-foot center. No worries, Mark was no stranger to taking risks if the reward was clear. With his last on-court action proving all-star worthy, at best this was going to be the next great guard-big tandem, terrorizing teams for years to come. At worst, well, I don't know if we got the worst, but definitely something close to it. With everything in place for the future, Dirk bid the city of Dallas adieu, having totally transformed a helpless franchise over the course of 2 decades. He gave them so much. He was one of the first superstar stretch bigs to catch on. His loyalty to the franchise who'd taken a chance on him never wavered. He went toe-to-toe with some of the greatest players this league will ever see, and carved out a piece of history for himself. There's no guarantee anything like 2011 will ever happen again. His job was done here, and as the 2010s came to a close, he'd given full reins to the city's next great. Luka also wasted no time reaching full potential, averaging nearly 30 points in his sophomore season. He ranked 4th in MVP voting, added 9 rebounds and assists to go with it, and helped Dallas right back to the playoffs in a season which ended at Disney. Porzingis didn't look terrible either. The pairing just hadn't shocked and awed the way we hoped right away. But as an overall team, it nearly did. To everyone's surprise, not only was Luka capable of regular season dominance so soon, he got fairly close to pushing the LA Bulls to the brink, creating one of many playoff highlights to come when he knocked us all to the ground with this.
Back to Doncic. Doncic pulls up, 3-pointer. Bang! Bang! It's good! Doncic wins the game at the buzzer!
For a moment, we weren't sure they wouldn't flat out upset a contender during his first postseason. We were sure this had legendary written all over it. Unfortunately, the duo's less than stellar start turned flat out bleak when Porzingis tore his lateral meniscus during the series. He'd actually torn it in game 1 and played on it for 2 more matches. The big was already lacking a good bit of the spunk he'd shown off in New York. With repeat injuries, we were doubtful in year 1 this would ever fully go as planned. We were right. He played just 43 games in their second season together, leading up to a very subpar playoff performance in a rematch against LA. Worse than his performance, he'd later admit he wasn't even giving his all out of spite of being misused in the offense, the second notable player to not get all the way down with Carlisle. Immediately, trade rumors would swirl, as the experiment was off to a miserable start. And Doncic was now in year 3, already an established superstar. He'd posted another monster season, yet the roster remained in that mid-tier where there were no solid expectations yet. This is what made people forget how, with everything he'd done to the Clippers so far, he'd lost both series. Even the one here where they took both of LA's home games and very much looked like they'd come back a year later to actually finish the job. It was just tough, cause his numbers looked like something from a year 6 LeBron playoff series, while his second best scorer was Tim Hardaway Jr. Quietly, however, while Brunson hadn't broken out or anything, he was earning his playtime and putting himself in position to show something down the road. Just like that, we were headed into year 4 of Luka, which is a scary time in the modern NBA, especially for Luka. He'd been so good out the gates, it wasn't like a lot of young guys who take time to get a great team before they actually start winning. He'd had them on the brink of the second round against contenders twice already, and very much appeared to be prepared for a run with adequate support. Rolling into 2022 with familiar names such as Dorian Finney-Smith was already getting old. Then in February, what we assumed to be true came true. The Mavericks sent Kristaps Porzingis to Washington for Spencer Dinwiddie and Davis Bertans. Wow. I think KB's an incredible talent, but we need that shooter in Bertans, and we needed another ball handler in Dinwiddie who could create a shot. And unfortunately, that was the only way we were going to get them, Cuban explained. It was that simple, getting 2 guys who fill roles that we really needed. And the fact that we have played okay without KP, I think that doesn't take anything away from him being a great talent, and I actually think he's going to be better with the Wizards than he was with us. As funny as this statement probably sounded, and as funny as it was he'd literally just asked why he'd ever trade him just months earlier, he was spot on about everything here. Porzingis simply wasn't going to form a contending 1-2 punch, whether because of injuries or playstyle. Also, the resulting team was massively successful, as you'll see in a bit. All these factors aside, Kristaps later revealed his relationship with Luka had been a bit contentious, with the two not ever having communicated so well. Cuban made the correct move. The 2022 Mavs entered top 4 territory in the West as Brunson began starting consistently and showed he could be a legitimate scoring option and ball handling threat. This also just so happened to manifest during a contract year. Adding to the opportunity, Dallas would be without Luka to start the playoffs due to a calf strain. While being tasked with Utah, it seemed very unlikely the resulting roster could win playoff games without him. Except by now the book was out on how to handle the Jazz, quite easily I may add. Brunson absolutely shined, scoring 41 points in Game 2, helping Dallas to a 2-1 lead before Luka ever even returned. You remember what we all said at the time? Oh, he's a Knick. First, we didn't know for sure he would actually sustain this type of play, yet the showing was so good we just all knew they'd be lining up to sign the first guy who even looked like he could do something for them. Also, his dad was part of the organization. Meanwhile, the way he scored made it feel unlikely he'd mesh with Doncic at a championship level. So would Dallas tie up their cornerstone's future with a guy he might not even fit with? Questions for later. Here, Brunson had done enough to steer the ship, helping oust Utah in 6 games with averages of 28 points on nearly 50%. They weren't done. The second series would bring an actual contender, the Western Conference champions as a matter of fact. All season long, they displayed dominance, looking like the favorites to return if they could conquer Golden State. Luka had other plans. Never mind another top statistical series, he just demoralized Phoenix on their home floor in Game 7, shot after shot, purposefully embarrassing the Obs. Memes. Dallas led by 30 points at halftime. It was one of the most baffling performances to witness live, and the thing he'd been trying to do to the Clippers actually happened here. This was after trailing 0-2, by the way. You couldn't have got anyone to believe they completely flipped the script. Yet, here they were in the West Finals with a team I can't say was really convincing. Obviously, Brunson's production dropped with the top dog being back, and the rest of the roster just did not scream championship or contender, though they'd clearly played at an adequate level. The Warriors wasn't having it. They quickly crushed any hopes of a premature finals appearance, but the Mavs were on the right track, and there was an important offseason ahead. To the question earlier, could Jalen Brunson really be Jalen Brunson next to Luka? Does anyone believe so? I mean, considering what happens next, maybe there was a way. Though one playoff run was not enough to just put the max on the table for a guy who could have just as easily never shown that prowess again. So long story short, Dallas wasn't matching the money New York printed, and the move we'd seen brewing since Game 2 against Utah came to fruition. On one hand, it was appropriate care to not potentially ruin years of Luka's career with a potentially poor financial decision. On the flip side, the resulting roster wasn't cutting it, and they needed to come up with something sooner than later, as it was now year 5. Sure, they'd given him a $200 million contract to start the season, but you know, star player happiness and stuff. The ink never really promises anything. At least for the moment, however, there was time. Time Cuban had no intention of wasting per usual. In February of 2023, as Dallas sat at a disappointing 31-26, they used the fallout of the Kyrie situation to commence a fairly sizable deal to acquire him. Kyrie Irving. How many different ways could this go wrong? Injury prone, constant distractions, never quite knew when his attitude would just sour on a situation with no warning. Would his play style fit with Luka when we'd already assumed it wouldn't have gone great with Brunson? Didn't he already fail to coexist with a more dominant number one when they needed to win? I mean, they won many years ago. Then he almost immediately left. This was yet another risk from Mark that could very well be worth the reward. For the 23 season, however, it was a bit too late. Kyrie was coming off a foot injury, and Luka was dealing with his own right around the time they got him. In an insane conference per usual, their record was already holding on for dear life. A random run was completely out of the question, but then they didn't even make the playoffs. Questions immediately arose surrounding whether Irving would even re-up here, as he was consistently being linked to the Lakers. Irving even later revealed how before being traded, a LeBron reunion was indeed on his mind. It's difficult to accurately describe how catastrophic his leaving over summer would have been. Amongst the risks Cuban took here was the high price for a potential rental. Crisis averted. On July 8, 2023, they reached an agreement on a 3-year extension, assuring he'd essentially ride out the rest of Luka's contract by his side. Just a couple of days earlier, they'd swung a deal with OKC for their 10th pick in exchange for Derek Lively, a relatively quiet but significant move. As the season progressed and the electric duo found ways to successfully coexist despite injuries to Irving, Cuban was active for the 3rd straight trade deadline, pulling off masterful deals to bolster the wing with PJ Washington and add even more size with Daniel Gafford. Wow. Barely a year ago, it was looking as if one different move from Kyrie Irving could jeopardize the rest of Luka's years here. By the middle of the season, the roster looked terrific. Their rookie was proving invaluable, and Irving, for the games he did play with Luka, showed it could happen at a winning level, and not just create highlights. It was a big question I personally had. At this point in his career, he was able to produce off-ball when needed, while also still being perfectly capable of filleting defenders. It worked to the tune of 50 wins, setting them up against the Clippers in the first round once again, this time with more than adequate help. Also, these weren't even the same Clippers. PG had gone through multiple years of injury by now, with the wheels having clearly fallen off for Kawhi. They didn't struggle much, finally conquering their demons on try 3, immediately bringing them face to face with the up-and-coming Thunder. OKC had been at it for a while by now, building year by year with young assets and finally looking ready and healthy enough to make a real run. Dallas surged and took them apart as well, although just narrowly avoiding a Game 7, which could have gone either way. The matchup was actually conference finals worthy. Speaking of which, the Mavs had now achieved for the 2nd time in 3 seasons. It was becoming routine. If Luka had another star or a good fitting roster, he could get them to contention. He now allegedly had a championship roster. The final test would be against another young team who'd been aggressive in their pursuits, as Minnesota came to the conference finals looking good enough to even give the Celtics problems. Issue was, as Anthony Edwards once remarked, Rudy Gobert don't put fear in nobody's heart. Luka flat out hunted him for the same perimeter shot he struggled to guard over and over again through the years. Taking home court advantage, they didn't let up. Ant wanted to take the Kyrie challenge, and he kind of didn't have a choice. Someone needed to be on Luka and another needed to be on Kai. Nothing worked. In 5 masterful games, the duo ran circles around the Wolves, essentially ending their contending days for now, and after 13 long years, once again broaching the NBA Finals. Their 3rd in franchise history and under Mark Cuban. They never had a chance to win it though. For some time, it'd been obvious the Boston Celtics were going to the finals, which only got clearer as injuries piled up in the East. While many fans chose to pick against Boston just for the bit, one needed to do no more than line the rosters up side by side to see where it was going. While it was over in a hurry, it was hard not to be happy with the Luka era so far if you were Dallas. Early on, as mentioned, the flack for not having help picked up earlier than usual because Luka had them competing before they were actually supposed to. It'd be like if the Spurs signed just one more decent guy right now and were all of a sudden in the West Finals. Wemby is incredible, but there's no world where they're one role player away from title contention or even beating other contenders. Yet, in 4 playoff bouts so far, Luka had either pushed a better team further than expected, flat out beaten them, or gone to the NBA Finals. I also don't think Mavs management gets credit for not fumbling where they easily could have. They took no more time than needed to get Kristaps out when it wasn't working. They didn't overreach to sign Brunson, who very likely wouldn't be posting his New York numbers next to Luka. They immediately secured his replacement, made sure he didn't just end up a rental, then quickly put the duo in position to succeed. Compared to how it goes for a lot of other stars, I think they've done a decent job making sure Luka's eyes would never wander. And as we speak, the next chapter is being written. Back to the meme referenced earlier, they're currently struggling because their best guys can't stay on the court together. Knick-knack injury here, a few weeks out there. Yet they remain in the middle of the West, which is the same position they made last year's finals from. It's ultra competitive as usual, only their soon-to-be rivals in OKC have jumped a couple of tiers since their meeting in last year's playoffs, and it's looking like an uphill battle to eliminate them in a few months after spending most of the season just trying to have guys stay on the floor, though it might not matter by then either. The NBA is rapidly changing. A team or player who was prominent last year could be an afterthought based on a few crucial decisions. Since the turn of the millennium, Cuban has generally taken the ship in the right direction, except he is no longer steering it. Not by a stake anyway. In June of 2024, he sold his majority rights, aiming to help the team in other ways. If he never does anything else significant going forward, I'd be hard-pressed to say through all the other bullshit, he hasn't been possibly the most significant NBA owner in recent memory. Sparring with David Stern and the media endlessly, constantly hovering over the team like a hawk, with a hands-on approach which helped him always generally know which direction they should be going. Something you really can't say about a lot of other owners, clearly. The team has been in tough spots, yet he's kept the 2 legends of the franchise happy, and has mostly kept the best team possible around them, constantly on the lookout for deals to improve, or moves in the present which would set it up best for the future even if the public doesn't agree. Other players have even spoken of the differences in franchises, the top tier level the organization operates at in terms of amenities and accommodations for players. Even little details like how there'll be a microphone on the rim so opposing teams can hear their clanks. It was actually one of the most distinguished things for a team in the 2000s. He bought it as a fan, and at the beginning even put in legwork directly to get people to come see a team who'd seemed hopeless over a decade. With 1 championship to show for, well, that's a lot more than certain franchises have to brag about. And especially for relatively recent expansion teams. With Luka and a good team around him, they're in a pretty good spot for the future. Yet, only time will tell if they're capable of adding more. And here, a couple of weeks later, I think we can confidently say they will probably not be adding more. I spent a month on this video and posted it 24 hours before Luka Doncic was traded. And via a lot of copyright funniness, we're here with the chance to kind of go over what it is that happened. How did it go from me titling a video, "How the Dallas Mavericks Keep Avoiding Disaster," to them inviting disaster a day later? Well, as mentioned earlier, the season was not going ideal for Dallas. There were injuries here, injuries there, yet they'd still been able to win some very interesting games against contenders. And they've mostly been in the, hey, if they're healthy or when they're healthy tier. We were blindsided. There's really no other way to put it. There wasn't a single conversation being had about a Luka Doncic trade, not an imminent one. There were theories as you now go back on YouTube, or the algorithm has probably recommended to you certain videos that now look like they were made by Nostradamus. Yet there was no real indication this was in the works, it was happening, and as we learned, it was because GM Nico Harrison just didn't share the details with literally anybody else, except Rob Pelinka. And that's the part that remains so suspicious even here weeks later. How do you have a generational star at the level of Luka Doncic decide you don't want to pay him the upcoming $300 million, but don't talk to anybody about it? You don't go see what teams will give you the entire farm. Because there are certainly teams who would have given the entire farm. Then the only semi-credible arguments out there have been, well, hey, he didn't want to get everybody involved. He didn't want to get Luka's camp involved. He had his sights set on someone he wanted. He did the deal with little fanfare. And yes, that's the end. That is the most logical explanation we've had in 2 weeks. Which still doesn't make sense because you didn't get everything from the Lakers. They were still an unprotected pick. Didn't get some of the supporting players. And so even if genuinely your plan was to swap Luka Doncic for an aging Anthony Davis who hadn't been critically hurt recently, yet the potential still existed for, how did you not end up asking for and receiving everything? I've also tried to bring up to people because I felt as if ownership has just totally evaded responsibility here. As a GM, you would not be able to take this deal to ownership and not be fired unless it had their backing. And so for some reason, and especially as we got the comments from the governor of the Mavericks, they were keen on this. They were tired of Luka. Clearly they didn't want to pay him. His work ethic has come up, his conditioning, the team he brings around. For a million reasons in their own minds, Mavericks management was done with him. And so they commenced what will likely remain the biggest trade and most surprising trade in sports history for quite some time. I don't know what'll top it. We believe Shams was hacked. It's the first time many people actually bought NBA conspiracy theories. The Mavs, just 1 year after reaching the NBA Finals, hinged their short-term future and possibly long-term on Kyrie Irving and Anthony Davis. Now, that's the catch, because management was then able to tell their disgruntled fan base, hey look, we're still contending, this is still a great team, and they were kind of right. Kyrie, AD with these supporting pieces is still a really good team with potential to go far, if you remain healthy. And this is the part where there's no justification for the trade, because regardless of what you thought of Anthony Davis, you had to know something like what happened on his first game was possible. And beyond the obvious, why would you even do this to your team? The interviews looked as demoralized as you would expect. Nobody was happy with it. I believe Klay came here with the sole intention of playing mostly with Luka. The money too, but he definitely wanted to win. And when you talk about doing this while Kyrie has a decision to make this summer, which it is a lot of money, so who knows what he'll do, there still remains more questions than answers. At this moment, their success hinges on AD coming back in a couple of months, which we only have a couple of months to the playoffs, learning a new system, being healthy through the playoffs, and them going on a run. And if this doesn't happen, which it probably won't, they now have to re-sign Kyrie over the summer, keep this core together, stay healthy through another season, and make another run. I don't think these outcomes were likely enough to trade Luka Doncic, and especially for not what they traded him for. And it'll remain the most infamous move in sports history, quite possibly. I mean, Nico needed security, which, while I don't agree with, I very much saw coming. An entire city heart was broken. Many fans have claimed they'll stop watching the league overall, but definitely the Dallas Mavericks, and they're right to. What was supposed to be their franchise cornerstone now, and I still can't believe I'm saying this, continues his career with the Los Angeles Lakers, which is just so convenient for the league. Truthfully, it'll probably be a while before we know what actually happened here. We know what they've said, yet hopefully following me, you've been able to figure out NBA personnel say a lot of things. And as the weeks have passed, I still believe there's just something deeper here. I understood the out of shape comments, I understood the money. I did not understand the deal or why the deal happened the way it did. In any case, a once promising future for these Dallas Mavericks now is completely murky as to who they'll continue with. In my mind, where they'll continue. It doesn't take a lot of looking to see ownership's motives and the fact they clearly care about more than basketball. A lot of owners do. This was just the most egregious example. As sad as it is to say, suddenly the 2011 championship is looking like the only one they'll don for a long, long time.